has been romanticised and fictionalised as Bonnie Prince Charlie, the undisputed hero who appeared in Scotland to lead the brave Highlanders against the Hanoverian government oppressor. His opponent in battle, the Duke of Cumberland, was labelled the Butcher for his treatment of the Jacobites at and after the Battle of Culloden. These two figures, pitted against each other, have become in some accounts little more than caricatures. The truth is more complex, but no less dramatic and shocking. Culloden was the last full-scale battle to be fought on British soil, and the culmination of the last Jacobite rising. Its result was not a foregone conclusion until Culloden. The Jacobites had fought this particular campaign undefeated, and their army, like the British army, was composed of both professional and non-professional soldiers. While perhaps two-thirds of the Jacobite army of Culloden were Highland Gaels, the rest came from the Scottish Lowlands, France, Ireland and England. Likewise, within the Highlands, many major clans supported the British government. The impact of Culloden was all the more devastating, as it not only set clan against clan, but divided families, pitting father against son, husband against wife, and brother against brother. It was part of a much larger global war. The battle itself was over within 1 hour, but its repercussions, particularly on the Gaelic culture of the Highlands, were felt for many generations. Yet Highland life had already begun to change. Culloden's aftermath accelerated the dismantling of the clan system and gave a foretaste of what was to come with the Highland clearances when many Gaels were forced from their land. Setting the scene. So this is a quote from B.C. York, from the life and correspondence of Philip York, Earl of Hardwicke, Lord High Chancellor of Great Britain. A young man, not generally esteemed of considerable character or parts, should land in a corner of the island, and in 6 months' time have seized on the capital city of Scotland. It is dreadful and amazing that the work of so many wise and 1651, Charles was forced into exile on the continent. Almost a decade later, England restored its monarchy, but Charles II's reign was soon marked by intense religious division as he attempted to introduce toleration of Roman Catholics and Protestant dissenters. Anti-Catholicism was widespread, and the 1673 Test Act went so far as to exclude Roman Catholics from both Houses of Parliament. In 1677, partly in an effort to re-establish his own Protestant credentials, Charles II arranged the marriage of his niece Mary to the Protestant prince William of Orange. When Charles died in 1685, his younger brother James, aged 51, and a convert to Catholicism, succeeded to the throne peacefully to become James the Seventh of Scotland and the second of England's Highland. 3 years later, his Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, and it seemed that a Roman Catholic dynasty could soon be a reality. But before the baby was 5 months old, the king's nephew, William of Orange, landed a large army in England to popular support. As the king's own disaffected army and navy gradually deserted to join forces with William, James fled to France. Mary and William ascended the throne in 1689 as joint monarchs and defendants of Protestantism. In Scotland, however, where Stuart monarchs had ruled for over 300 years, loyalty to the deposed James remained strong. Francis Edward Stuart, known to his opponents as the Pretender, on the throne. But the rebellion lacked strategic initiative and was checked by government troops. Faced with defeat, James was forced back to France, never to return to Scotland. In 1719, the Jacobites mounted a second rebellion. This time, they secured the support of Spain, but storms at sea prevented all but 300 Spanish troops arriving in Scotland. Attempts to recruit Scottish soldiers raised an army of around 1,000 men, but they were too poorly equipped to defeat government troops. On George I's death in 1727, his son was crowned King George II, and like his father, he too faced a Jacobite threat. This time, however, the rising of 1745, the 45 under the leadership of Charles Edward Stuart, would give the government rather more cause for concern. By 1745, political infighting, charges of corruption at home, and military setbacks abroad were beginning to undermine the authority of the Whig government. The Jacobite Rising of 1745 took the government by surprise. So this next chapter is life in Scotland, the background to the 45. Who were the Jacobites? Jacobitism was the political movement dedicated to restoring the Stuart kings to the thrones of Scotland and England. The Jacobites took their name from the Latin form of James, Jacobus, after their deposed king, James VII. People became Jacobites for all sorts of reasons. Many embraced Jacobitism because they believed the Stuarts to be the lawful kings. For others, it was a principled refusal to accept Parliament's right to decide British royal succession. Many Catholics hoped the Stuarts would end discrimination laws, while others resented what they saw as English domination. Many were Scottish patriots who opposed the 1707 Act of Union. Some were motivated by intense family loyalties, while others were simply swept up in the adventure. Whilst the majority of Jacobite support came from Highland and Lowland Scotland, there were also English, Irish and French Jacobites. So here is James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, James VIII and III, born 10th of June 1688 at St James's Palace, London, died the 1st of January 1766 in Rome. He's buried at St Peter's Basilica, the Vatican, Rome. Father was James VII, mother Mary of Modena. He married on the 3rd of September 1719 Maria Clementina Zableski, daughter of the Polish king John III. His children were Charles Edward Stuart and Henry Benedict Stuart. So here is Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie or the Young Pretender. Born on the 31st of December 1720 in Rome, died on the 31st of January 1788 in Rome. Buried first in the Cathedral of Frascati, where his brother was a bishop. On his brother's death, Charles's remains were moved to the George II spent the summer in Hanover, an ill-advised absence that fueled the increasing discontent with his regime at home. The military focus on the continent left Britain exposed, and Charles saw his chance. By raising enough support for the Jacobite cause, he hoped to persuade the French to reactivate their plans for an invasion of England. He knew that this was probably his only chance. The Prince sets sail. After the ill-fated initiative of 1744, Prince Charles continued to badger French ministers for commitment to another invasion. But this was not forthcoming, so in secret, and without the knowledge or support of his father, the Prince developed a plan to assemble an armed expedition in spring 1745. Charles knew it was impossible to land in England without an army, so he decided to sail for Scotland, where he had been told numerous supporters would welcome him. Funded by Jacobite benefactors, he fitted out a small frigate, the Du Tillet, and a larger man of war, the Elizabeth. Under the pretence that this was a normal privateering cruise, before he departed, Charles wrote to Louis XV. Having tried in vain, by every means, to meet your Majesty in the hope of getting, out of your generosity, the help I need to enable me to play a role worthy of my birth, I have resolved to make myself known by my deeds, and on my own to undertake a project which will be certain to succeed with a moderate amount of help. Such help would be crucial if the rising was to be a success, for France was one of only a handful of Western European powers with military and naval muscle capable of forcing the restoration of the Stuart monarchs. In 1744, a small number of Scottish Highland clan chieftains had promised that they would rise if Prince Charles arrived with as few as 3,000 French troops. Charles had raised far fewer men. Nevertheless, his ships, loaded with weapons, supplies and money, set sail for Scotland on the 5th of July, 1745. But only 5 days after leaving France, they were attacked by a Royal Navy warship, HMS Lion. Both the Lion and the Jacobite's Elizabeth were badly damaged and had to limp back to their home ports. Remaining undetected aboard the Du Tillet, Charles pressed on, and on the 23rd of July, 1745, he landed with a handful of supporters and 7 close companions on the island of Eriskay in the Outer Hebrides. Raising the standard. Convinced that the British were longing for him to liberate them from Hanoverian oppression, the Prince was astonished when first one clan chief and then another told him to go home. Determined not to retreat, he sailed to the mainland, arriving on the 25th of July. Prince Charles may have had few weapons and fewer troops, but what he did have was charisma, charm and persistence, all vital qualities in winning over the hesitant clan chiefs. Charles was also liberal with the truth, saying that the French king had agreed to send substantial aid and that English Jacobites had pledged to rise for him. Neither of these promises was true. The clan chiefs were uneasy about the lack of French assistance, without which, many believed, the rising was doomed to fail. Times had moved on to prince's appearance in an area of the Highlands remote from the seat of government meant that it was over a week before the authorities heard of his arrival. Despite widespread unease among government supporters in the Highlands, there was little sense of urgency. Most of the British army was in Flanders and Germany, leaving an inexperienced army of about 4,000 men in Scotland under the British General, Sir John Cope. The Black Watch Regiment, traditionally the government's Highland force, had been moved in 1745 to the south of England to help with defence plans against any possible French invasion. Despite Prince Charles's military experience being limited, he took on the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Jacobite army. The man who was to have the most influence within the Jacobite army was Lord George Murray. By 1745, in his early 50s, he had supported the Jacobites in the risings of 1715 and 1719 and had spent several years in exile on the continent. But in 1724 he had come back to Britain, and the following year was granted a government pardon. Initially sceptical of Charles's chances, Murray visited Sir John Cope, the commander of government troops, in August 1745, and Cope appointed him Deputy Sheriff of Perthshire. But within a month, Lord George, apparently driven by his conscience, had changed his allegiance to join the Jacobite army, where he was made a lieutenant general. He was to play a crucial role in creating military discipline and order. Leading his army north into the Highlands, Cope was met with little support. He lacked proper information about the Prince's army, and believing the Jacobite force to be stronger than it really was, he decided to avoid an engagement at the pass of Corrie Erac and marched northwards to Inverness. Ironically, the military roads constructed under General Wade to allow the government forces to patrol the Highlands only served to allow the Jacobites easy passage through the country, and with the road clear, the Jacobites marched south unopposed. The charismatic prince raising recruits. Following his cool welcome on the island of Eriskay, Charles sailed to Arisaig on the west coast of Scotland, where an enclave of Catholics would protect him. The prince expected support from Scottish Roman Catholics for a Catholic dynasty, but their number was very small, and in fact he benefited more from discontented Episcopalians and anti-Unionists. But to many in Scotland, Hanoverian rule was preferable to Stuart kingship. Most Scots were Presbyterian and traditionally hostile to the Stuarts, and Charles failed to win them over. 1745 was not a national rising. Jacobite recruiters sometimes used bribery and threats to fill the ranks. In early September, Charlotte Robertson, Lady Lude, entertained Prince Charles at Blair Castle, where she held a ball to drum up support. To those who refused to join him, she threatened to seize and carry off their possessions. The Jacobite army existed for barely 9 months, most of which were spent in the field. From the outset, it was decided that the whole army would wear at least one tartan item, underlying the differences between the Jacobites and their opposition, on the principle that nothing encouraged men more than seeing their officers dressed like themselves and ready to share their fate. Lord George persisted